Some houses are designed to be seen. They stand on hillsides overlooking city lights, monuments to success, their windows, like 1,000 eyes staring out at the world, demanding admiration. But other houses, the truly interesting ones, are designed not to be seen. They are fortresses of solitude, tucked away in the folds of a landscape, built not for applause, but for survival. This house, baking in the relentless Arizona sun, was the last fortress. It doesn't look like the home of a millionaire, a king of country music who sold over 80 million records. It looks like the home of a man who had finally, blessedly, stopped running. This was Waylon Jennings' final sanctuary. But to understand the profound silence that settled here, you have to understand the deafening noise it replaced. It was a noise composed of screaming arenas, of the ceaseless rumble of a tour bus, of the ghosts of 4 different women who had once promised forever, of 6 children scattered by the winds of his ambition, and the internal roar of a man locked in a lifelong war with himself. Most people remember Waylon for the outlaw swagger, the black leather vest that seemed like a second skin, and the battered Fender Telecaster that spat chords of pure rebellion. But the clues to the real man, the one gasping for air behind the legend, aren't in the concert halls or the platinum records. They're hidden right here in the architecture of his life, in the homes he built, the homes he fled, and the one, long ago, that he was never truly able to save. Our story begins not in a mansion, but in a place that feels like it's at the very edge of the world. Waylon Arnold Jennings was born in 1937, not into comfort, but into the hard-packed, unforgiving dirt of Littlefield, Texas. The home he was brought into wasn't a piece of real estate. It was a temporary shield against the elements. A simple wood frame shack where survival was the primary and only design principle. His father, a laborer and truck driver, moved the family from farm to farm, a nomad chasing seasonal work in the shadow of the Dust Bowl. For young Waylon, home wasn't a fixed point on a map. It was a state of perpetual motion, a fragile concept that could be dismantled and moved at a moment's notice. This lack of roots does one of 2 things to a person. It either instills in them a desperate, lifelong longing to put down their own, or it teaches them to live comfortably, even preferably, in the chaos of movement. For Waylon, it did both, creating a paradox that would define his entire existence. He didn't just learn music, he inhaled it as if it were oxygen. It was the one thing that was truly his, a tool for psychic escape from the bleak landscape. His mother, Lorene, saw the spark in him and taught him his first chords on the guitar. By the age of 12, he was a DJ on KZZN in Littlefield, his voice already possessing a gravelly, knowing authority that felt ancient. He was a coiled spring of restless ambition and raw, untutored talent. You can see it in his eyes in those early photographs. He's looking past the camera, past the dusty plains of his childhood, towards a horizon no one else could see yet. He didn't just want to leave Littlefield. He wanted to build a world so vast and opulent that the memory of this shack could be entirely blotted out. The first blueprint for that new world, however, would be drawn by a man who would become both his mentor and the most significant ghost to haunt his life. Buddy Holly was a fellow Texan, another boy who used music as a rocket ship out of Lubbock. He heard something special in Waylon's raw talent and took the young man under his wing. He produced Waylon's first single, and in the winter of 1959, hired him to play bass for the ill-fated Winter Dance Party Tour. Waylon was just 21 years old, and he was being strapped into the epicenter of the rock and roll whirlwind. Life became a blur of highways, screaming girls, and fleeting towns. The tour itself was a grueling, chaotic journey through the frozen upper Midwest in a repurposed school bus that was notoriously unreliable, its heater constantly breaking down. It was the very antithesis of home. It was a rolling, sleepless world of anonymous hotel rooms and greasy spoon diners, a life lived entirely in transit. And then came the night in Clear Lake, Iowa, the moment that would forever alter the emotional architecture of Waylon's life. After their show at the Surf Ballroom, Buddy Holly, frustrated and bone-tired of the miserable bus, decided to charter a small 4-seat Beechcraft Bonanza to fly to their next gig in Moorhead, Minnesota. Waylon was supposed to be on that plane. He had a seat, but he gave it up. J.P., the Big Bopper. Richardson was coming down with the flu and complained about the prospect of another freezing night on the bus. Waylon, in a simple act of kindness, offered him his spot on the plane. The story everyone knows is the chillingly casual joke they shared just before takeoff. Holly, seeing Waylon preparing to board the bus, teased him, "Well, I hope your old bus freezes up solid." And Waylon, with the unthinking bravado of a 21-year-old, shot back a reply that would become a nail in his soul. "Well, I hope your old plane crashes." It's a line that would echo in the empty rooms of his mind for the next 40 years. A throwaway comment, a bit of road-weary banter that was transfigured by fate into a horrific prophecy. The crash in that Iowa cornfield that killed Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper wasn't just a national tragedy that marked the day the music died. For Waylon Jennings, it was a profound, personal, and inescapable trauma. He was the one who was supposed to be on board. Survivor's guilt became a permanent, toxic resident in his soul. For decades, he ran from it. He ran headlong into his music, into bottles of whiskey and mountains of cocaine, and into the arms of a series of women who offered fleeting moments of shelter from the unending storm inside him. His early adult life was a chaotic tapestry of short-lived marriages. He was just a boy of 18 when he married his high school sweetheart, Maxine Lawrence, in 1956. They had 4 children together in quick succession, Terry, Julie, Buddy, and Dina. But Waylon was a phantom husband, a ghost father. He was already married to the road, to the music, to the desperate need to outrun the memory of that plane crash. The homes they shared were just houses, temporary addresses where his bags would land for a few days before he disappeared again. He was trying to play the part of a family man, but the costume never fit. He was just a visitor in his own life, a stranger to his own children. The divorce from Maxine was messy and painful. Another failure he packed away. The ink was barely dry when he married Lynn Jones in 1962. She was a fiery, independent woman, and their union was a brief, explosive collision of 2 strong personalities. It lasted 5 years, but it was volatile. Another attempt to build a foundation on the shifting sands of his burgeoning career and inner turmoil. Then came Barbara Roode in 1967. This marriage was even shorter, a footnote in the story of a man who was now moving too fast to be tied down. Each marriage was a desperate, failed attempt at normalcy. The houses from this period are barely documented, lost to time, because he was never truly in them. They were just stage sets for a life he hadn't figured out how to live, spaces that absorbed the echoes of arguments and the silence of his absence. His real home was the smoky honky-tonk, the sterile confines of a recording studio, the rumbling belly of a tour bus. He moved to Nashville, but he wasn't buying the Nashville sound. He was becoming a star, the reluctant but defiant pioneer of the outlaw country movement. He waged war against the slick, string-laden productions of Music Row, demanding creative control. This public fight for artistic integrity was a perfect mirror of the private battle he was waging every single day. The Nashville establishment was polished, predictable, and safe. Waylon was raw, unpredictable and dangerous. He wanted his music to sound like it had lived a little, like it had dirt under its fingernails and whiskey on its breath. And his chaotic life was providing him with a surplus of material. Then in 1969 in Phoenix, Arizona, he met the woman who would finally provide an anchor, though their life together would be anything but a calm harbor. Her name was Jessie Coulter, a singer-songwriter of formidable talent and even more formidable grace and resilience. She was different. She was a woman of deep faith and quiet strength. She saw the frightened boy from Littlefield hiding behind the outlaw armor, and with her, he would finally attempt to build his first real home, a place that would become a legend in its own right, a character in the Nashville soap opera. They called it Southern Comfort, and for a turbulent time in the 1970s, it was anything but. Located in the affluent Nashville suburb of Brentwood, it was less a house and more a self-contained compound. Waylon bought it at the absolute peak of his fame and fortune, a time when he and his fellow outlaws, Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, Chris Christopherson, were the undisputed hell-raising kings of country music. This house was an unambiguous statement. The boy from the sharecropper's shack in Texas now owned a sprawling mansion. But look closer at the design choices. This wasn't an open, welcoming southern home. The entire property was surrounded by a tall, imposing brick wall with heavy wrought iron gates that were always closed. This wasn't the y'all come on in architecture of a friendly country singer. This was the barricade of a man who craved privacy to the point of paranoia, a man deeply suspicious of the very world that had made him a millionaire. The inside was a direct reflection of his chaotic, brilliant, and increasingly troubled mind. It was a labyrinth of over 20 rooms, many of them dark, paneled in heavy, oppressive wood that seemed to absorb all the light. And at the heart of this maze, he built a state-of-the-art recording studio. This was the engine room of the house. Here, he could work at all hours, chasing melodies in the dead of night, insulated from the rhythms of the outside world. That studio, a marvel of 1970s technology, was the heart of his creative genius, but it was also the altar for his most destructive demon. Fueled by a prodigious cocaine habit that cost him, by his own candid admission, up to $1,500 a day, the equivalent of over $7,000 today. This house became his creative cocoon and his gilded cage. The parties were the stuff of Nashville legend. The massive living room, dominated by a floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace, was a surreal social theater. On any given night, you might find members of the Hells Angels drinking beer next to visiting literary figures like Shel Silverstein. Fellow musicians, industry executives, and the kind of shadowy characters that populate the fringes of fame all mixed together in a haze of smoke and ambition. His best friend and neighbor, Johnny Cash, who lived just a stone's throw away, was a constant presence. Their bond was forged in a shared understanding of fame's absurdities and the same relentless demons. They were brothers in arms, and this house was their shared bunker. Jessie Coulter, in her stunning memoir, An Outlaw and a Lady, described the house as having a revolving door. It was a place of immense, explosive creativity and of deep, soul-crushing pain. One room in particular tells the entire story of this period. It was a small den, barely larger than a walk-in closet located off their master bedroom. This was Waylon's inner sanctum, his ultimate retreat. He had it soundproofed, a room within a room. Inside there was a pinball machine, a television, and a telephone that was his lifeline to his dealers. He would lock himself in that tiny dark space for days on end, disappearing from the world, from his family, from himself, caught in the throes of cocaine-fueled paranoia and manic creative energy. It was a panic room, but the terror he was hiding from was already inside the room with him. The rest of the sprawling mansion was Jesse's ongoing, valiant attempt to impose some semblance of order and grace on the chaos. She filled it with beautiful art, with shelves of books, with comfortable furniture that invited connection. She fought to make it a real home for their son, Waylon Jennings, better known as Shooter, who was born in 1979. There was a large swimming pool in the backyard, a sun-drenched oasis of childhood laughter that stood in jarring contrast to the darkness that could consume the rooms within. The kitchen, often the heart of a southern home, was a space Waylon rarely entered. He wasn't a domestic man. His domain was the studio, the soundproof den, the road. The rest of the house felt like it belonged to a family he was observing through a one-way mirror. This Nashville mansion was his war room. It was where he fought the record labels for his artistic freedom, where he created his most iconic, genre-defining albums like Honky Tonk Heroes and Dreaming My Dreams. But it was also the battlefield where he very nearly lost his war against addiction. He was a multimillionaire, a cultural icon, living in a palace of his own design, and he was profoundly, desperately miserable. He knew he had to escape, not just the industry, not just the persona, but the very house he had built as a monument to it all. He had to burn the fortress down, metaphorically, to have any chance of saving the man trapped inside. The decision to leave Nashville in the mid-1880s wasn't just a change of address, it was a desperate act of surrender and a profound act of survival. Waylon finally decided he had to get clean, or he would die. He rented a house in Arizona for 1 month, and with Jesse's unwavering superhuman support, he quit a 2-decade, $1,000-a-day cocaine habit cold turkey. He locked himself away, enduring the physical and psychological hell of withdrawal, and emerged a month later, shaken, frail, and reborn in the cleansing desert sun. He had to shed the outlaw persona because he finally understood it was a mask that was suffocating him, and he needed a new home, a new kind of architecture that reflected this new sober man. That's when he found the ranch in Chandler, Arizona. This is the house we saw at the beginning, and it could not be more different from the Nashville mansion. Gone were the high brick walls and the intimidating iron gates. In their place was a simple fence. The house was a sprawling, single-story ranch designed not to dominate the landscape, but to become a part of it. It was open, unassuming, and flooded with natural light. Large windows looked out not at manicured lawns and nosy neighbors, but at the raw, untamed, majestic beauty of the Sonoran Desert. This house was a sanctuary. Its very design spoke of a man who was no longer hiding, no longer at war. The interior was simple, comfortable, almost rustic, reflecting a man who had shed all pretense. Beautiful southwestern art, a quiet tribute to his Texas roots, adorned the walls. There was still a studio, of course. Music was his lifeblood, not his addiction, but it wasn't a dark, hidden cave for nocturnal escapes. It was a bright, airy room with windows, a place of work and joy, not of desperation. But the most telling feature of this Arizona home was the kitchen. For the first time in his life, Waylon took an interest in the domestic heart of the house. He loved to sit at the large kitchen island, drinking endless cups of coffee, reading the newspaper, and just talking with Jesse. He became, after decades on the run, a homebody. He learned to appreciate the quiet, steady rhythms of a life lived off the road. This house was the place where he could finally be a present husband and a real father to Shooter in a way he had tragically never been to his older children. It was a house built for healing, for quiet contemplation, for reconciliation. He called the property the Flying W Ranch, but there was no ostentatious sign, no branding. It was a private joke, a gentle nod to his past. The only flying he was interested in now was watching the hawks soar on the desert thermals. He hosted regular poker games, but they weren't the wild, drug-fueled parties of Nashville. His guests were old, trusted friends and family. The ghosts of his past were still there, of course. The guilt over Buddy Holly, the wreckage of his previous marriages, the years incinerated by drugs. But here, in the vast, profound quiet of the desert, they didn't scream so loudly. They whispered, and sometimes he could finally ignore them. There's a little-known story about this Arizona house that reveals everything about his transformation. Waylon had a magnificent collection of antique coin-operated machines, gleaming Wurlitzer jukeboxes, mysterious fortune-telling machines, vintage pinball games from a bygone era. They weren't just collectibles. They were potent pieces of nostalgia, sacred relics from the very carnivals, fairs, and honky-tonks where his impossible journey began. In the Nashville house, they would have been a noisy, blinking centerpiece. But here, in his final home, he kept them all in a special room, lovingly restored, but he never plugged them in. They were silent, polished and beautiful, but silent. The man who had lived his life at maximum volume now found a deep, resonant peace in the silence of these dormant machines. It was a powerful, symbolic admission. The show was finally over. His health, however, was a debt coming due. Decades of hard living, a chain smoker's cough, and a diet lived on the road had taken their brutal toll. He was diagnosed with severe diabetes, which began to systematically dismantle the outlaw's body. First, it took his mobility, confining him to a wheelchair. The man who had stood so defiantly on thousands of stages was now trapped. Then, in December of 2001, complications from the disease forced the amputation of his left foot. The Rambler, the outlaw, who had crisscrossed the American landscape on sheer will, was now permanently grounded. His final days were spent in this house, in his favorite leather chair, looking out the large window at the desert landscape that seemed to mirror his own rugged, weather-beaten resilience. He faced his own mortality with the same blunt, unsentimental honesty that defined his greatest songs. He passed away here, peacefully in his sleep, on February 13th, 2002. It was 43 years, almost to the very day, after the plane crash in Iowa that had set his life on its turbulent, tragic, and triumphant course. After his death, Jesse Coulter eventually sold the ranch. The home was emptied of his presence, his cherished collections auctioned off to fans and connoisseurs. For a while it sat there, a silent testament to the man who finally found his peace within its adobe walls. People might call it an abandoned house now, but a house is only truly abandoned if the story it tells is forgotten. Waylon Jennings left behind a net worth estimated to be around $20 million, a catalog of music that carved its own face onto the Mount Rushmore of American culture, and a complicated, often painful legacy as a husband to 4 women and a father to 6 children. But the real story isn't about the money or the fame. It's about the profound journey between 2 houses. The journey from the dark, fortified mansion in Nashville, a monument to the tormented outlaw he thought the world demanded, to the open, sun-filled ranch in Arizona, a sanctuary for the man he truly was. One house was a reflection of his fame. The other was a reflection of his soul. The first was built to keep the world out. The second was built to let the light in. And it's in the quiet space of that final home where the jukeboxes were silent and the music finally stopped that you can hear the clearest truth about Waylon Jennings. It's the story of a man who spent a lifetime running from his ghosts, only to discover that the only way to find peace was to finally, bravely, come home to himself. The wrought iron gates and soundproofed walls were gone. replaced by a simple porch and a wide open view of the eternal horizon. He didn't need a fortress anymore. He had finally found his comfort, not in a brand of whiskey or a mansion's imposing name, but in the stillness of the desert and in the unwavering love of the woman who waited for him there. The house wasn't a tragic end. It was a quiet, hard-won, and beautiful grace note on a life lived impossibly, gloriously loud. And that wraps up today's video. If this video resonated with you, please give it a like, leave a comment with your feedback, and subscribe to stay updated on upcoming videos. Appreciate you watching.